Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here, and thank you for your patience as we sorted through the inevitable technical difficulties here. So my name's Kelsey Speakman. I'm facilitating our session today. And before I introduce the other folks up here in front of me, in front of you, I want to acknowledge the land on which we're meeting, the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So we had intended at this point in our session to turn the floor over to one of our guests, Elder Caroline Récollet, who had graciously agreed to open the panel in a good way for us, but she had an unexpected conflict arise last night and had to return home to her family in Wikwemkong unceded territory. And she, of course, expressed a great deal of regret about breaking this speaking commitment to all of us, but it occurred to me as a settler that I have actually a much greater commitment to her in terms of encouraging her to go home and attend to those family and kinship responsibilities that are really the real foundations on which we're all meeting here today. So I'm sure that we are all certainly excited to have the opportunity to learn from Elder Caroline, but I hope that you can join me in also being happy to wait for when she has time to share with us. So in the meantime, I'd encourage you to check out her work with the traditional ecological elders, and you can find the website there. I've had the great fortune to attend CAFS for many years, and it certainly feels like kind of coming home to me. And there's many people who add those ingredients to make this feel like a home, so I just want to thank Maria and Aleph, who helped organize this session along with me, and Janelle and Kristen and all the other folks who put together this event, and also the Participatory Food Systems Governance Project, who many of you may have just seen speak, and they funded some of the guests here today, so we thank them for that. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge my fellow participants on a CAFS 2023 plenary who became co-authors on an article in the Canadian Journal for Food Studies, which was the inspiration for the metaphor recipe exchange that we're working with today. And that a few of them are here in the room: Stephanie, Laurence, Rayhan, Anson, Nora, and David. So in that piece, to set up what we're talking about today, we use this metaphor of a recipe to consider how food studies has come together as a field where too many cooks actually don't spoil the broth, and how we might continue to involve that in the future. So even though there can be a kind of prescriptive connotation to the idea of a step-by-step recipe, we were interested more in the idea of recipes as creative models for generating improvisations. And we were writing mostly from the perspective of emerging scholars who are relatively new to the field, but the folks here on the panel are some of those foundational figures that we were learning from, and whose ingredients that we built on and have brought us all here together today. There's certainly no way to capture in words all of the experience that these folks have, but maybe we can think about that as well as a kind of line in a recipe that's just a little taste of who they are. Mustafa Kosh is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Toronto Metropolitan University. He was among the founders of the Centre for Studies in Food Security, Food Secure Canada, and the Canadian Association for Food Studies. We have Wendy L. Wilson, who was born and raised in Jibiduk, also known as Halifax, and she's a descendant of African Nova Scotians who have history in the province for more than 400 years. She works on many things, including food culture and food sovereignty with Food Secure Canada, Just Food's Black Food Sovereignty Working Group, the Pan-Canadian Black Food Sovereignty Caucus, the Indigenous and Black Food Sovereignty Circle, and the Coalition for Healthy School Food in Nova Scotia. And finally, we have Martha Stegman, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. Her community-based research and collaborative video work examine Indigenous settler treaty relations with particular attention to food sovereignty and justice. So join me in welcoming them, please. Okay, I'm going to turn things over to the people you really wanted to hear from in a second, so I'll set up the questions that we have for them. So I think this might be better if we were in a kitchen in someone's home, but of course we know that these lands are still in many ways kitchens of some sort and homes for many people and non-humans as well. So I'd invite you to imagine here that we're all cooking together with these guests and learning the recipes along with them. So I'm going to ask each of you to work with this metaphor of a recipe in a literal way, in a more conceptual way, and share with everyone a key ingredient that you and the organizations that you've worked with or communities you've worked with have contributed to the formation and reformation of food systems and food studies in Indigenous Territories and Canada. So I'm hoping that they will tell us about what a key ingredient is, what their recommendations are for how people might work with that in the present, as well as how you might hope that future generations would carry that forward into the future. Okay, whoever would like to start, but maybe we'll start with Wendy.
Yeah, so one of the key ingredients that I think is so important to add to any recipe, and I will be adding it to every single thing that I cook in terms of traditional food, right? So I just want to tell you a little bit about African Nova Scotian food. It is a cuisine. It really took some time to legitimize it. It's always been legitimized because as African Nova Scotians, we were eating the same thing across the province, and I knew this was a fact that we enjoy the same types of foods. There's over 52 Black communities in Nova Scotia, and we're eating the same type of meals. But also, we're placed in Mi'kma'ki in the Maritimes, and so other people are eating some of the same foods as well. One of the key ingredients that I put into any traditional food that I'm making, when I'm in the kitchen making these meals, full disclosure, my partner does the majority of the cooking. I cook traditionally. I cook the African Nova Scotian food. I cook the food that when the family comes over, this is what I'm making. You know, they're looking forward to the things that my mother cooked, that my grandmother cooked, that my great-great-grandmother cooked, that people are cooking in other Black communities from the southern part of Nova Scotia right through to Cape Breton. And that key ingredient is memory. That is memory. Because whenever I'm cooking these traditional dishes in my kitchen, my mother is in that kitchen with me. She's passed, but I can feel her. I can see her. You know, when I say I can see her, when I look in the mirror, I see her reflected back at me. And so we talked in the last session that it was about this symbol called Sankofa. And Sankofa means to reach back and get it. It's a Dinkra symbol from West Africa. And it is really, the actual image is a bird looking backwards, body facing forward, but looking backwards at an egg on its back. And so implying, you know, past, present, and future. And I think it's so important to carry on these food traditions throughout generations. And so when we get together with family, there are always, you know, elders as well as kids. And the really great thing about adding memory to food is that you add the memory, you have that, we talked about institutional history as well and memory. We have all that knowledge and information, but then we pair it with wherever we are. So the memory of the food that would have been original to African Nova Scotians would have come from the southern United States, right? This is where our people come from the southern United States. And they brought those food traditions with them, those recipes with them. Well, with us, really. We brought those with us, and then we married them with some of the African methodologies, like the way that you cook the food, and then also with the Caribbean spices and the way that we season our food, and then also with the land. Like now, this is what the land has to offer us, so we have to change the recipes up. We have to adapt to the recipes. And so when I think about adding this ingredient to our food, we are more than just, you know, conjuring up a recipe or nourishing our bodies, we're nourishing our minds. We're also nourishing our souls, our spiritualities. We're bringing this awful foe to the table. I think this is a picture of myself, my brother, my older sister. We have a really big family. That's just a few of them. Usually when people come over to my house for dinner, for any family event, there's always at least 30 of us that are there for a meal, and that's only just a fraction. African Nova Scotian families are large. Like I said, we are part of 52 Black communities, and so when African Nova Scotian person tells you their last name, which we always ask, like, who are you? What is your name? Don't want to know the name that you're married with. What we're really asking is, who are your people, right? And then once we know who your people are, then we know what community you're from. The second ingredient, and I think, I'm wondering if anyone else is going to mention this, but we always talk about it. The second ingredient is love. So my brother Jamie, who's sitting toward the back there, he is the best cook. And so I will cook traditional African Nova Scotian food, and I'll name a couple of those things. Fish cakes, salt cod fish cakes, and baked beans with the ham hock in it, and green beans, and mac and cheese, and we do the curry chicken, and we do the oxtails. We always do the oxtails. We always do fish. The fish that I grew up on is fish that came out of I know all fish comes out of the water, but we actually got our fish out of the water. We never bought fish from the grocery store. We always bought fish from people that we know in community or fished it ourselves. And then the other thing that's really interesting about African Nova Scotian food is it's very in line with Indigenous food as well. So we eat, we do rabbit and we do eel. Eel was always a big thing in our family because this is who would have shown us the ropes when we migrated to Nova Scotia. So when I think about adding this ingredient of love to the recipe, it's healing. Right? It's a transfer of energy. It's a transfer of the energy. And if you ever had a meal from a mad chef, someone who was upset in the kitchen and cooking, it's never as good as when they're cooking it to heal you, the chicken soup and those other comfort foods. And so I think love is always, it's a necessity to add to the foods, and it's also a transfer of our actual kinetic energy into the food, thinking deliberately who we intend to eat this food. And so memory and love would be my two key ingredients.
I was thinking about finding some different ingredients. Initially, I thought about maybe some key ingredients like wheat, rice, but I would really, like Wendy, I thought about more metaphorical ingredients that the food cannot be imagined without. So the first ingredient I will pick is justice. Since mid-1970s, many concepts such as food security, food sovereignty, food justice, food democracy have been used regarding the conditions of food provision in market economies. These can be viewed as competing or complementary discourses that address the same issue with varying emphases. Food justice, in my opinion, refers to the power inequalities within the food system. Injustices occur not only in terms of access, but at all stages of the food system, from slaves to victims of man-made famines, from plantation workers to migrant farm workers, and from indigenous communities who are denied access to natural foods to homemakers and domestic workers who endure the drudgery of the kitchen work. Most suffer food injustice. Today we had sessions on food banks and presentations on food banks. I came to Canada in 1979, and as a foreign international student, the first thing I noticed that we had hunger in Canada. It was the time of the People's Food Policy, the Food Commission, but we did not have a food bank in Canada in 1971. The first food bank opened in 1981. And right now, we have over 2,589 food banks reporting. And the last year, last March, the number of people who got food from food banks exceeded 2 million a month. So when I'm talking about food justice, that also includes all those people who are lining up in front of food banks. Often people suffer injustice, do nothing. They thank God and thinking that they are still better off than their neighbors. Others may view getting involved in change and telling the truth to power is too risky. Thus, the presence of injustice does not necessarily indicate a desire to end it, unless people are organized and the times are right. The times are right means times of crisis, like today, such as the mid-1970s, when food security emerged as a discourse and the hegemonic powers also sought solutions or could not stop change for some reason. The second concept I like to use is peace. The most significant cause of rising food insecurity and deaths due to starvation during the 21st century has been armed conflict. Wars are horrible events. Wars destroy lives, wars destroy livelihoods, they destroy the economy, environment, and for peace and for development. A paper by Samuel Robbins in 2024 estimated that between October 2023 and October 2024, within 1 year, there were about 54,000 direct deaths and 67,000 indirect deaths that would be attributed to the conflict in Gaza. These were slightly more conservative estimations than the 186,000 direct and indirect deaths published in an article in The Lancet in July 2024. And by the way, we are in 2025. Shockingly, the estimates and included 62,413 deaths due to starvation.
In 2021, a report from the Costs of War project at the Watson Institute at Brown University revealed that 20 years of post-9/11 wars have cost the US an estimated $8 trillion. Think of $8 trillion. Start counting tonight. I bet you will be still counting till the end of June. The report estimated that the human toll of the 20-year war was around 925,000 direct deaths and 4.6 million indirect deaths. In Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and Philippines, approximately 38 million people have been displaced. These numbers do not include figures from Africa, Latin America, or South Asia. While the impacts of these wars are worse in locations where they take place, the economic and human toll spreads like waves in the water around the world in the form of refugees, new regional conflicts, higher inflation, and unemployment. In her paper, The Credit Card Wars, Linda Belms stated that most of these expenses were incurred with borrowed money, and she argues that America's method of paying for the post-9/11 wars has profound implications for the conduct of public policy. These include reduced transparency over the spending process, lowered accountability for war expenditures, weakened fiscal discipline over the defense budget, less meaningful public debate over the wars, transfer of the financial cost to future generations, failure to provide resources for accrued promises to veterans. So next time, when you complain about rising prices of groceries, rising tuition fees, long lines in emergency rooms, problems with public transit, or the number of people experiencing food insecurity at home and globally, consider what we are paying for. So I will end with two slogans. One is you are familiar with, no justice, no peace. And you can say the same thing, no peace, no justice. Thank you.
So, hi everyone. I'm very honored and humbled to be invited to be part of this conversation. My name is Martha Stagnan. I am of mixed Irish, German, mostly French descent. Lots of different flavors of Catholic, via Quebec on my mom's side and Louisiana on my father's side. And I got my start in the food movement in the mid-1990s, working in the urban agriculture and community food security movement in Montreal. And when the language and framing of food sovereignty started taking hold, that framing got me asking questions about whose land I was building food sovereignty on. And so those questions drew me home to Nova Scotia, to Milwaukee, where I grew up, and where I had met different groups of Mi'kmaq and non-native fishing communities who were building relationships, engaging in some pretty amazing conflict resolution, and even trying to find the grounds for solidarity in the wake of the Supreme Court's Marshall decision that recognized the treaty rights of the Mi'kmaq people to earn a quote-unquote moderate livelihood through commercial fishing. And so I was kind of blown away by this conversation. I got sucked in. And what it means to be a treaty person, what it means to be a settler as a treaty person, what my responsibilities are to those agreements, to the land, to the Indigenous nations whose territories I work and live on, in the context of the food movement, has been kind of an overarching frame for most of the work that I've done since then. And so the ingredient that I want to bring to the table, or offer to the table, is Sean Wilson's concept of relational accountability. Sean Wilson is a Cree scholar who wrote, among many things, an incredible book called Research as Ceremony. And as I understand relational accountability, it's the idea that when we do research, when we do work, when we are in the world, we have to act cognizant of the responsibilities, the reciprocal responsibilities that we have to all our relations, to all of life, to the plants, to the animals, to the waters, the lands, to ancestors, and to future generations. And of course, as a settler, I center or think a lot about my responsibilities to Indigenous nations within that kind of framework. And so I would offer relational accountability maybe not as an ingredient, but more as kind of like the roux or the Holy Trinity that's at the basis of a lot of New Orleans cuisine, or the tarka or the sofrito, right? That kind of base layer that gives richness and gives flavor that you put everything on top of. And so what I would offer in terms of some of the components of that for me are lessons or are sort of overarching questions that I've gleaned from some of the Indigenous teachers and collaborators that I've had the privilege of learning from and working with over the years. So I'll name 4 of those. The first comes from Quegsi or Lloyd Augustine, who's a traditional chief and leader in Esquimalt Church. And I very naively, when I started my master's, interviewed him, asking him what he thought his treaty rights were as a Mi'kmaq person. Because, if you're not happy with what the federal government is recognizing. And so he very good-naturedly laughed at me. And he was like, my rights are inherent, they come from the Creator. The treaties are for you guys. You guys are the ones who have treaty rights to live here in peace and friendship as long as you respect the spirit and intent of the agreements that your ancestors made with mine. And so Quegsi gave me kind of the overarching research question, which is, what is the spirit and intent of the treaties, and what is my responsibility towards those? The next item I put in the room comes from Sherry Pictou, who is a community leader from the River First Nation, also Cook, on the Bay of Funny in Nova Scotia. And Sherry and I have been in deep conversation for 20 years, so maybe one thing I've learned from Sherry is kind of weird, but I will name something that I learned from her in the first film that we made together called In Defense of Our Treaties, which profiled the kind of resistance that her community had vis-a-vis the Department of Fisheries and their rollout of the Marshall decision in the early 2000s. The critique of that kind of matches Glenn Couthard's sort of politics of recognition. And so what I learned from Sherry in that was the inseparability, the deep inseparability of colonialism and capitalism, the ways that these systems of power are deeply interconnected, of course, along with, heteropatriarchy and white supremacy and some of those good stuff. But that we can't understand capitalism unless we understand settler colonialism. We can't resist the impacts of neoliberal restructuring and capitalism in the food system unless we're also resisting settler colonialism. The third piece that I'll put into the room comes from Carrie Prosper from Buckley Bay First Nation, also in Nova Scotia. Carrie and I worked on a film together called Seeking the Duglamic, and it was about the traditional laws that govern fishing, specifically eel fishing, in the Mi'kmaq world. And so the Duglamic, as I understand it, is it's like a very expanded understanding of sustainability. The idea of making a living from the land and providing for your community in a way that recognizes those reciprocal responsibilities with all of life, that recognizes the community that you're providing for includes the plants, the animals, the ancestors, future generations, and that is anchored in a very deep understanding and respect for the cultural and spiritual and physical and biological connections Mi'kmaq people have to the land. And so from Carrie, I got a glimpse into this Indigenous worldview, these legal structures and traditions that the treaties that I'm a party to are anchored in, and the cue to try, to the extent that possible through my settler mind, to understand what my relationship to that legal tradition and system is, and try to honor it. And the final one, the fourth one, comes from Ange Loft, who's a Haudenosaunee multidisciplinary artist who, among many other things, led the Talking Treaties project here in Toronto. And I was part of working with Ange on a film called By These Presents, Purchasing Toronto, which was kind of an absurdist recreation of the negotiations between the Mississaugas and the British, leading to the so-called Toronto Purchase of Treaty 13 here, as well as the Treaty Guide for Torontonians. And so coming from the Mi'kmaq work that I had done, I was bringing the question that I got from Quincy: what is the spirit and intent of the treaties here? How do we honor them? And Ange was not at all interested in that conversation. Ange was interested in exposing the colonial archive. She wanted to say, what did the British say, and what did the British do? And so, the British were incredibly brazen and calculated and cunning and wrote it all down. From Ange, I got a reminder, as Hayden King and Eva Jewell from the Yellowhead Institute have talked about how treaties are both portals towards Indigenous governance, but we have to also remember that they are and have been used as strategic tools of colonial dispossession. And so taking up responsibilities in the context of that means being sort of open or both.
Okay, so thank you for sharing all of those ingredients with us. Something that struck me as I was listening, when I think we'd originally kind of formulated these questions, we'd thought about asking everyone to select one ingredient. And I noticed that as we're talking, and I don't think this is just a result of us all being like long-winded academic folks. I think the fact that we all had paired and layered ingredients really speaks to the fact that you can't actually isolate a single ingredient, and that the relationship between ingredients, the bringing them together is when the magic really happens in recipes. So with that in mind, I'm wondering if you can respond to one another's ingredients, maybe think about some of the interesting combinations that come from bringing them together, or even some of the dissonances. And just to remind you, we heard from Wendy, memory and love. We heard from Mustafa, justice and peace. And we heard from Martha, relational accountability, which contains many layers within it. So, if he wants to take a stab at that first, we will. Can we start with Mustafa?
I'm not good in remembering certain stories, but this is the story I once read to my son. It's about a Yiddish wise man in an old Russian village and making stone soup. And many of you may remember this story, or you may remember different versions of it. But the elder puts a stone in the pot, and then he invites everybody in the village to bring one particular ingredient from their houses. And at the end, somebody brings an onion, somebody brings a carrot, somebody brings a potato, and it's a fabulous soup. Everybody loves it. So I think when it comes to food, the stone food recipe is the best one. I cannot imagine a soup. I cannot imagine the kind of food item without Wendy's love and memories. And I cannot imagine the food system without justice and peace. And accountability is essential. And remembering, and actually from ancient traditions, I wish we had our other speaker was here to remind us about that. And I think combining them is probably the best way of doing our soup or whatever you like to eat today.
So just reflecting, and I love the idea of when we're thinking about food, we're thinking about food justice. And there are so many elements, so many layers, so many variables to food justice, to people being able to get the food that they need, to be able to get their cultural foods, to even have access to foods, and in particular, the types of food that they have access to. So I've already mentioned this yesterday to someone, and I'm going to mention it again because it was just a really profound moment for me when an elder, Byron Beardy, from Four Arrow Nations, I believe, in Manitoba, he said something to me so simplistically, but I said it was so profound. He mentioned that when you're born, food is included. Well, it is, right? Right? We all have access to food. Now, I'm thinking about food as like a commodity, and how in Nova Scotia, we forage for food all the time. Like, people are families. My father's family, who grew up in a rural community, that didn't have a grocery store. Actually, the community that my father grew up in didn't even have a school, because schools were segregated at the time, and in order to have a school, you needed a school teacher, you needed a building to have that school in. They had neither, so there was no school for 29 years in his community. There was no grocery store. They didn't need a grocery store. Everything that they needed was on the land. They foraged for it, they fished for it, they snared rabbits, and they hunted, moose and deer. And so this notion of having enough food, I had to record, like I thought for a long time, for 6 months, I thought, up to a year, what Byron is talking about is everyone has this inherent right. But then I thought, one afternoon, I was sitting at my desk, and out of the window, I could see a deer who had come along. I think they were eating like the acorns that had fallen off of a tree. And I thought, he's not even talking about the food in the grocery store or at the market. He's talking about the food that the land has to offer. Quite often we think about traditional farming, we think about, raising cattle, but when are we ever really stopping to think about what nature has already provided for us, right? That sense of being able to have access to the land. And so when I think about food justice, I think primarily, foundationally, I think about land. Think about the land as everything that we need. It has, in Nova Scotia, we had, in Canada, the red maple tree. This red maple tree was used for shelter. It was used for food, fuel, the sweet water that came out of the tree as well. There's so many uses, and I think we really need to think about this idea of justice and also the approximation and the connection to land. And I love the idea of a roux, because no one's really thinking about the roux, but the roux creates the meal. The cornstarch or the roux or the flour, the thickener, the thing that combines the ingredients together. We can taste the ginger, we can taste the turmeric, and we can taste the chicken. We're not really thinking about the roux, and we need to really be thinking about those things, those invisible things that bring things together, that really allow people to synthesize, right? To collaborate, to bring people from different tables even together for a meal and to learn from each other. So I really love the ingredients. I'm probably gonna take some of the ingredients that y'all just mentioned to me today and make sure that I'm adding that to those ingredients to my meal as well.
So my mother grew up with intense roux envy from all of my father's sisters. So there's a lot of thinking about the roux in my mother's kitchen. And lots of memories of my mother talking to my aunts over the phone and being like, I know it's supposed to be mahogany. What does mahogany look like? But I loved, Wendy, I loved hearing you talk about memory and love. And I loved you talking about keeping your mother alive in the kitchen. That's absolutely what I do as well. And I loved hearing you talk about fish cakes and fish, because so many of those dishes I also grew up with, having grown up in Nova Scotia, but of course with a different flair, with a different set of flavors. And it made me think about the importance of anchoring ourselves in who we are and where we come from in these conversations. It made me think about the way that the food movement has always been a place where we could come together and talk about and work on these larger questions of justice in a grounded way, because we're doing something that's about connecting to the land and taking care of the land. And then having conversations about other justice conversations in that context. And I'm still thinking about the $8 trillion. But thinking about, sometimes I find myself thinking so intensely about what it means to be a person here, what it means to be a person on this land, with this particular set of histories. But your contribution reminds me of how important it is to telescope out and to think about the global systems, the global political systems and systems of violence that we're implicated in, and thinking about food sovereignty and food justice, not just in terms of the way that we're finding each other here, but how we're participating and connected to these larger international structures and systems through our daily food choices and our daily food organizing as well. So thank you for both of you for that.
I was very glad to hear Wendy mention that she was going to be taking on some of these ingredients, because that is the sort of way that we imagine this session as a kind of recipe exchange. So in that spirit, I'd like to open things up to all of you for the next 10 minutes or so to hear how you've been using some of these ingredients in your work, or this is also your opportunity as our studio audience here to ask our recipe developers how they work with their ingredients and ask them questions about that. But I will open up the floor if anyone has a question that they would like to
close. Yeah, and I love the commonalities of food. Like I love like the varieties of what people do, the ways that they cook it, the different spices that they add. And with the fish cakes in Nova Scotia, our fish cakes are like maritime fish cakes for African Nova Scotian people. So just soft cod and potato and onion, and that all comes together. You fry it in lightly dusted, fried in the cast iron frying pan. But I imagine that when we came to Nova Scotia from our Caribbean roots, from our southern United States roots, from the continent of Africa, it's like we all have a fish cake, a variety of fish cake. We just use the ingredients that were available, and so the chicken soup will be the same thing. So we can think about how we take these commonalities and the type of dishes that we have, and it's just a different variety or spin. And that's what's so beautiful about food. We're all already somewhat familiar with it, and then you just got this whole different take on it, right? And you're learning how to synthesize, incorporate, kind of change your recipes. And I think with culture, and I think with recipes and food as well, they're always evolving, right? They're evolving to the next thing. And that's why it's so important to have the younger generation in the kitchen and experiencing these meals so that they can come up with the new recipes regardless of where they were and where they are. Because what my people did is they just worked with what they had. They took all those memories, that familiarity, and they brought it to Mi'kma'ki, and they created a whole new culture, a very unique culture with a repertoire of different recipes, different methodologies and way of cooking, and brought that to the forefront, which we now call African Nova Scotian cuisine.
And I think fish cakes and salt cod is a particularly evocative ingredient when we're talking about international connections as well, because, dry fish is part of cuisine in West Africa, it's part of the cuisine in the Caribbean, it's part of the cuisine in the Maritimes, and the reason for that is because of the triangle trade.
Right. Jamaica Newfoundland connection, the rum, the fish cakes,
all of that, right? So it was the salt cod from the Maritimes that was feeding enslaved folks in the Caribbean, and that was making its way to West Africa in that trafficking, in that trade. And so that's why elections are bought with rum, where we're from. Or used to be anyway. Why that's such a big part of it, right? So it highlights these connections, it highlights these historical connections, these systems of power that we all belong to in different ways, and the cultural migrations that happen, and solidarities as well in the context of that.
This is a question of how do we hide the zucchini in the chocolate chocolate cake. Is there someone who wants to take that on first? Maybe Mustafa, we haven't heard from you.
Yeah, I mean, it is really important to, because many of us like to eat. We know that we have to survive. In order to serve, we need to eat in order to survive. Okay, but if we hear that the food that we are eating is contaminated, it's going to make us sick, it's going to kill us, we try to avoid those items. Okay, I think the important thing is to tell people that without, the food they need to imagine needs to be without injustice done. So if you are eating your food, in the meanwhile you are realizing that millions of others are suffering, I mean, you can say sorry, but you may also say, hey, you know what, this is going to hurt me too. This is going to have consequences for me. I gave you some examples about the costs of wars and how it is affecting our lives here. It's destroying lives over there, but it is affecting our lives here. People from CBC call me and ask, could you please, we like to talk about the food price inflation, and I cannot raise this question with them. They would not understand it. And somebody has to pay for all those bombs, for God's sakes. Okay? They don't come for free. You and I pay for them. But that's why I think food safety language and food education would be really helpful for all of us to collectively understand what is hurting us is what is hurting other people. Hunger in Toronto, food banks in our country is not hurting people who are going to food banks, but it's hurting the rest of us. And we got to understand that somehow. It's not easy, Wendy.
I'm just sitting here thinking about it. I love when you have like realizations and you're like, oh, that's the reason why. One of the things that in like quite often if we have a family gathering, it might be one person making a meal or maybe another time we'll all contribute. And one of the things that like you never have enough, there's not enough food if there's not enough food for people to take food home. Like if there's no food to take home, you failed, right? So takeaway plates, like takeaway plates. I'm also an artist, and when I'm convening with art, when I'm engaging in art, I always remember who was around, the conversations that were happening. And so when I go to pick up that art piece to continue it, it all comes back. What was happening the last time that I worked on this piece of art? And so I'm thinking about these meals that people take away. Everyone takes a takeaway. Sometimes people take the takeaway plates before they take their plate that they're going to eat. You open up the microwave, you got all these plates in there on top of the fridge. You got all these plates stacked because people are taking the food away, obviously, to eat it later. But also when you're eating it later, what's happening? You're coming right back that memory of the space that you were in, right? That memory of the people that are around and the good times and what was happening. And so when I think about food, I also think about food as really an art form as well, like in being just like art, love and the memories and going back to those dishes that really warm our hearts, that take us back to, when we were little children, or a memory that you might have had in another country, or it's always usually, associated with good things. Although every once in a while, I remember my partner saying that, what was it? It was some meal. I'm like, oh, let's have this meal. And they were like, no, the last time I had that, I got sick. Do you ever have that association with having a meal, getting sick, and then you just can't go? You just said it. Okay.
I had food poisoning a couple of weeks ago.
Right? And then, so just that association. But I think that it's very important for me to mention that some of these food traditions, these memories are things that we have to definitely be intentional about passing along to the next generation in order to honor those who came before us.
Your question made me think of a class that I normally, now at York, the students who take my classes because they take my food class because they wanted to take a food class. But the first time I taught that version of that food class was at Concordia, and it was not to students who thought food was an interesting subject matter. And so I had to kind of rope them in, and the hook was that this is the way for you to, we're looking at food as like a lens to understand globalization, because that was the unfolding process at the time. And through talking about food, they were able to understand that globalization actually was not just like a question of solidarity, but it was actually something that impacted the quality of their life and impacted them personally. And so, I don't know, food is like an interesting sort of gateway drug to be able to talk about systems of power in that way. And it's making me think about, I read about, what's his name, Kennedy's Make America Healthy Again thing that's going on right now. And I'm very well versed in trying to talk to students about, the food system as a lens to talk about neoliberal capitalism and, the white supremacy and settler colonialism. I need to sharpen my understanding now to be able to talk about the role of the food system and our relationships to land in relationship to fascism and authoritarianism, because that's the moment that we're in right now. So Robert Kennedy is he's using a lot of the language that we're using. He's talking about how young children don't have access, they're eating too many ultra-processed foods, and they're not having enough exercise, and all a lot of the same stuff that we talk about. So not really on topic, but maybe on topic. We have to kind of think through, like with some of Naomi Klein's doppelganger around, like this sort of body purity and fascism and food movement, and ways that we can have a window into those conversations, but really kind of staking out our territory in terms of what our analysis is and how it's different from his.
Thank you. Yeah, so I heard here a number of things. We heard education and art as these sort of vehicles to hide some of the things in to deliver, but we also heard, of course, food as a vehicle to talk about other important topics as well. I'd like to gather another question or comment from the audience.
So I'm just thinking sometimes the people that you're eating with is more important than the food that you're eating. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to eat a food that maybe not be so healthy, but I'm eating with people that I love, as opposed to having a really healthy meal alone, lonely in my place. I mean, everything in moderation, but we got also, food is just not about what we're eating. It's also, when I think about healthy food, I just don't think about it making my body healthy. I think about it making my mind healthy. I think about how the way we even collect food. Because we go collect food in nature, then we're connected to nature, and that's healthy as well. But I wanted just to mention really quickly, because you mentioned the hospital, you mentioned food poisoning, and and I talked slightly about a potluck, but usually whoever's host we're having dinner at is responsible for making the meal. When it comes to the African Nova Scotian community, we're really picky about potlucks. We're not eating everyone's food because we don't know, maybe the cleanliness of their homes. We don't really know what their habits are. I have 2 cats. I now know that there are a lot of Black people that won't come to my house anymore because I have these cats, but I'm okay with that. I'm okay. And so I said to my partner, who's actually not Black, she was in New Brunswick visiting her sister and their family. She came back with some kind of gastro something. And I'm like, well, you can just go to that room and I'll be down here because I'm not getting that. Because the thing about getting that is and she worked in an emergency room, as for the last 27 years, getting ready to retire at the end of this month. And here's the thing about being Black in Nova Scotia and getting sick. I don't know what's like in Ontario or in other provinces, but you don't know how you're going to be treated when you get to the emergency room. You just can't make that assumption that when you get to the emergency room that you're going to be treated fairly or in an equitable way. And so it's something that maybe not all white people think about. If you go to the emergency room, it might be full, but you aren't even thinking that, oh, they're discriminating against me because I'm white. You're not thinking that at all. And so this is the thing when it comes to first thing we do, we keep really, for the most part, kitchen's clean, washing our hands. Even if the house is not tidy, you know that the kitchen is, because we can't afford to get sick because we don't really know what's going to happen once we get down to the emergency room or with the nurses or the paramedics. And so it's just something to consider. I don't know if other people thought about that, but we're really super vigilant about making sure that our kitchens are clean, that our hands are washed, that we're not walking into a kitchen with our outside clothes on. You would never be able to come into my house with your outside clothes on and go into the kitchen. You would never be able to come into my house and open up the fridge. You need to wash your hands first. And so we think about these things because we don't know how we're going to be treated if we have to go into these public spaces.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just thinking as Wendy was speaking, connection with what Martha was talking about, these different versions of health in the RFK language versus the version of health where we're talking about who are we eating with and how is that community being formed, and those healthy food discourses certainly overlap in scary ways, as Martha pointed out. But I think this key ingredient of love is such an important one to return to differentiate. Time for one more question, but before I take that, I just want to let you know what we're going to end our final 5 minutes with, so that we can just jump into that once we have our final questions. You may have noticed that Maria has been writing down some points on our Bristol boards up here. So we're thinking of these kind of as recipe cards, these 3 pieces of white Bristol board up here, and we'd invite you in the last, however many minutes we have left, I imagine about 5, do a little bit more of a hands-on recipe exchange. So chat with one another if you have an idea about how you might want to use this ingredient in the future, how you've already used the ingredient. We have some markers up here, and you're welcome to write down some ideas, draw some pictures, and we'll move those to the exploration gallery tomorrow morning, and you can continue to add to that conversation there. Okay, so with those instructions out of the way, I'll gather a question up here.
I'm just going to say this real quick. I'm not going to take time, but when I think about memories, I always think about my mother and the way that she peeled a potato or an apple. She could peel a bit, and whenever I pick up a knife to peel anything, I'm always trying to emulate her, how she would just be able to get that one long peel.
I didn't learn. I'm still sad that I let my mother leave this world without teaching me how to make her pie crust. But I learned from my mother that love was shown through food, and that it was an anchor, and a way to build community and a way to show care. And so even though I don't think I remember learning how to make anything with her, the ethic and the importance and the centrality of it was passed down.
So you had to bring up that pie shell, because that's the other thing my mother was able to do. I always wanted to like be old enough to make the pie crust and then cut the extra off, that little thing that the round.
Mustafa, do you have a cooking technique, literal or figurative?
No, I mean, learning how to cook or doing the cooking work is really important for that association, because it's really, when you are preparing your food, you are engaging with nature. Food is the most basic engagement between us and the nature. And so we basically, when we are eating, we are taking part of nature and transforming it and making part of our system. It's a beautiful process. And I think that appreciation, that understanding that nature is getting part of us is very important. And it happens in the kitchen. And the basic thing is just imagine baking bread, like playing with the dough. It's not easy. And I understand you are a chef. So it's not easy. Everybody thinks that it is easy, but you really have to know how to fold it. But once you do it, it's great pleasure, both eating and also a masterpiece. It's your creation. So it's a very, very unique process. Food and eating is in my opinion, is just we become creators, and we appreciate the creation in a metaphorical way.
Can I pick up on that? Because I'm so glad you mentioned that. I wasn't going to, but we had the pleasure of being able to go to an Ethiopian restaurant last night. And so obviously we were eating with our hands, and we were taught growing up, the fork and the knife, and I feel like there's an element that's missing when you don't engage with your food and you don't touch your food. So I was sharing a story probably about 5 years ago. I like doing these informal experiments, right, or research, and so I challenged myself to note how many times a day I was connecting myself to something that was organic, nature, right? And so from the top of my day right until the end of the day, I reflected. And you know how many times I touched nature that day? Like something organic? 3. 1. I ate a banana. That was it. And so then from that point on, I'm always challenging myself to, even when I'm in a restaurant, even when I'm in a nice restaurant, if I can get away with touching I do that because it brings me so much pleasure, and it is that, that organic or connection to nature, right? That kneading the dough, like making pizza dough, like no matter what's going on, if I'm just focusing on that dough, I'm just feeling better. Like it makes me feel good. It's nostalgic, but also very healing to be able to connect with something that is actually organic.
I think this is a lovely place to conclude, not just because we're out of time, but also because I was thinking that this is just sort of like the first part of a recipe that we've done here. Our last question reminded us that we've listed a bunch of ingredients here, but now the question will be, what do we do with them, and what are the steps in the recipe next? So yeah, I think this idea of bringing forward action and the verb to these ingredients would be a place to take this story next. So as I said, you're welcome to add some thoughts in the last 2 minutes that we have in this space, but otherwise these recipe cards will be in the exploration gallery, so I hope you'll continue the conversation in written form, in conversation, and for those of you joining us at the social this evening, I hope this has helped to increase your appetite for some delicious food there. So join me again to thank our panelists here, and thank you all of you.